I used to think that Breath of the Wild was one of the greatest games ever made. In some aspects, I still think that's true. I reviewed this game very positively a few years ago, and I still agree with pretty much everything I said in that video. I was also very caught up in the new Zelda game hype. I had barely 10 hours logged, and I hadn't spent any time exploring the open world other than the main quest stuff. It was really more of a first impressions type of video. But since making that video, I've put over 200 hours into Breath of the Wild, and with the sequel on the horizon, feels like the best possible time to revisit the game and talk about some of the things I completely skipped over the first time around. I'd say most of my broader opinions of the game are still pretty similar, but this is more of a deeper dive than before. By the way, I'll probably not be avoiding spoilers in this video, so if for some reason you haven't played this game yet, now is your chance to click off this video. Breath of the Wild is probably the least Zelda-esque Zelda game there is. Gone are the classic Zelda dungeons with unique themes and atmosphere. Say goodbye to items like the hookshot because every item except for the Master Sword is now breakable. Link doesn't even wear green anymore, he's going through a blue phase right now. Nothing in Hyrule feels the same as it used to, and that isn't inherently a bad thing. Zelda has always been about reinventing its own formula. Wind Waker flooded the whole world and made exploration all about sailing. Ocarina of Time basically created the 3D game renaissance. It's in Zelda's DNA to subvert expectations, take risks, and do something completely different than what we've ever seen before. I would argue that Breath of the Wild reinvented the idea of reinventing past Zelda games. I would even go as far as to say that this game completely changed the way that open worlds are created today. So yeah, that feels like the perfect way to start talking about this game again, the open world. No matter how I feel about Breath of the Wild now, I can't deny that this is probably the best open world I have ever seen. Until this game came out, open worlds have really at their core been about scale and aesthetics. If the area was huge and looked good, it was probably a great open world. While Breath of the Wild is still filled with beautiful views, pretty much every frame of this game would make an awesome wallpaper, the focus is a lot more on how the player fits into the world itself. In fact, the surrounding map feels like it's really the main character of the game in a way. It's full of life, with things to do at every corner. I'd say my biggest mistake from my first review was avoiding this aspect of the game, because learning how to interact with the world and the smaller details of how things work is half the fun. Just think about how many things you can do with a tree in this game. You could cut it down to make a bridge across a gap, you could roll it down a hill to take out a group of enemies, you could continue to chop the tree up to make wood for a campfire, or create an updraft for you to fly somewhere. It's just insane how much you can do with such a simple concept, and I think that's what Breath of the Wild's open world is all about, letting you, the player, experiment with an open sandbox and try new things. There are some details about how you interact with the world that I'm still discovering even 200 hours into playing. I just found out the other day that you could change the properties of Choo Choo Jelly by shooting it with an elemental arrow. This was especially helpful when I was grinding for items while trying to fully upgrade my armor. There's just so much to learn and mess around with, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's still some concepts of the game that players haven't even found yet. One thing that I really appreciate about Breath of the Wild is how effective and well thought out the tutorial sections of the game is. Usually a game will force the player to watch a few drawn out cutscenes, dedicate small sections to teach the players certain mechanics, and the game will feel like it hasn't truly started until you finish the tutorial. I don't think there's anything wrong with a linear experience. In fact, I encourage it if you think it's necessary for the game you're trying to create, especially story-driven games, but Breath of the Wild is very different. Once you leave that first cave within the first minute of playing, you truly feel free. The game has now begun, and the way you learn the mechanics is truly up to you. You don't even need to follow the path in front of you, you could just turn around and head in the other direction. Obviously there are some barriers to the Great Plateau that prevent you from leaving without some pretty key items, but the way you obtain these items is pretty much all up to you. I think the best part about the Great Plateau is that it's pretty much a miniature version of the entire map you're going to be exploring later, meaning all the important ideas and mechanics will be discovered here. There's a snowy mountain area that will teach you the dangers of Link getting cold, and you have to figure out by yourself how to safely progress through it. Maybe you'll make a mad dash to the top to find a warm sweater for Link. Maybe you'll cook a cold-resistant recipe. You know, the smart way to do it. Or you could be dumb like me and make 100 campfires leading all the way up the mountain. The options of traversal are truly endless, and the Great Plateau does an incredible job of teaching the player to experiment a little. Something that really surprised me through my second and third playthrough of the game was just how well the exploration side of things held up. Not just the sandbox elements, but actually deciding which paths you're going to take. A great example of this is your first trip to Gerudo Desert. There's really unlimited different ways to get there. You could take a path from the Great Plateau, which will lead you through a dangerous valley filled with enemies, or you could head over the bridge where you might run into a dragon. It kind of takes a leaf out of the Dark Souls book, where an area of the map will perfectly weave into the other. The thing is, I rarely ever found myself sticking to a path. It just makes more sense to travel the unknown land and see what you might find along the way. This is the first Zelda game to introduce climbing. No, not this climbing, but real open-air mountain scaling. Of course, there are some restrictions to this, a stamina bar that can be upgraded later in the game, but if it runs out while you're climbing, you will most likely fall to your death. Weather can affect your climbing and make it near impossible to make any progress when it rains, but for the most part, the ability to climb is a real breath of fresh air for the franchise. I do think climbing becomes a bit overpowered later in the game, especially once you unlock the climbing gear and have a full stamina bar, but as a first attempt for the series, it's really impressive how well balanced climbing is in the early sections of the game. Now it's time to get a bit more controversial. One of the biggest arguments against Breath of the Wild's open world is that there's a lot of fluff. It's easy to say that the world is brimming with things to do at every corner, but the truth is there are like 5 different things to do repeated 1,000 times. One of these things you come across are the shrines, which act as puzzle sections of the overworld. Personally, I'm a fan of the shrines. It's impressive that there are 120 of them, and almost all of them are based around a completely unique mechanic or concept. Especially the strictly puzzle shrines, these are always fun to solve, and more importantly are filled with different ways to cheese them. The problem is that they do eventually start to feel a bit stale, especially if you're trying to complete them all. I kinda wish that they were a bit more unique visually. All of them follow the same look and feel as the rest, and it almost feels disappointing when you travel to an interesting part of the map just to find it's holding another shrine. My favorite shrines are the ones where the puzzles take place within the open world. A good example of this would be the Eventide Island shrine that takes away all your weapons and armor and forces you to survive on an island full of enemies. This shrine felt like a completely unique and well thought out idea that felt less like another shrine puzzle and more like a separate, fun level within the world. My least favorite shrines are the 20 different tests of strength, which force you to fight the same enemy over and over again with very little variation. I like that there's always something to encourage exploration in Breath of the Wild, but at some point it does end up feeling like fluff thrown in there for the sake of making the game feel more dense. I feel pretty much the same way about the 900 Korok seeds, which also require you to solve a small puzzle in order to unlock them. It's nice to make every corner of the map have something to do, but finding out that you did something just for another Korok seed is also pretty disappointing. The worst part is that there's really not a solid reward for collecting them all. You can unlock more storage space from collecting them, which is helpful, but after collecting all 900 of them, I expected something more than this. While these issues I have are really just me trying to get as much out of the game as possible, I think in small doses at the beginning of a playthrough, the discovery of shrines and seeds are still pretty fun. As far as the combat goes, I think that Breath of the Wild has probably the strongest out of any Zelda game so far. The variety of options and creativity that goes into taking out an enemy is incredibly fun to discover. They finally added stealth kills to a Zelda game, which became incredibly useful during more difficult sections of the early and late game. Things like parrying and flurry rushes are definitely a welcome addition too, and mastering these abilities is pretty rewarding. I think the environmental fights where you're rolling a boulder down a hill or setting fire to the grass around some enemies are where Breath of the Wild shines the brightest. It just feels good to do something other than blocking and swinging in a Zelda game. However, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. I think one of the most universally hated additions to Breath of the Wild are the breakable weapons. It kinda sucks when you find a really cool looking weapon and then it breaks after a single fight. It would be nice to have some sort of repair system where you could fix broken items at a campfire, but I do understand that the gameplay loop of finding new weapons would kind of get broken. It's just annoying when you're fighting a really tough mini-boss and you completely run out of weapons, so you just need to give up. The breakable weapons is a difficult system to fix, but I hope the value of weapons is a bit stronger in the Breath of the Wild sequel. On the bright side, there are tons of really unique weapons for different playstyles in this game. You could use spears, swords, bows, hammers, clubs, brooms, literally anything you come across. Need a quick weapon but all of yours broke? Cut down a tree and use one of its branches. Another reason why trees are OP in this game. I think the positives definitely outweigh the negatives when it comes to combat, but again, it's definitely something that I hope is improved upon in the future. For the most part, I think the variety of enemies is fine, the game is massive, and I understand it would be difficult to add even more than we already have. The different colored enemies showing different difficulty levels is a cool idea and concept, but I do wish there was a bit more depth to them in practice. Once you get to silver and gold enemies, they don't really feel any more difficult, but rather just take a lot of time to kill. I understand that rewards for killing gold enemies are pretty good, but it still doesn't feel worth it to break 4 of your best swords trying to kill one of these guys. I hope that in the sequel they make stronger enemies a bit smarter than the weak ones, maybe add some new moves or create an entirely new enemy altogether. The boss fights are fun when you are underleveled, and it seems like an uphill battle, but once you have enough resources like bomb arrows, you can take them out super easy. On the topic of bosses, I think my biggest complaint is directed at the final boss of the game, Calamity Ganon. As I'm sure you're aware, you can totally skip everything in this game and head straight to the final boss room right when you start, although it will be a pretty difficult fight. Instead of just fighting Ganon himself, you also have to fight all the other dungeon bosses one after another, which honestly makes for a really cool battle. The problem is, if you do all the dungeons before the final boss fight, Ganon is taken down to half health, and you only have to fight that one version of him. It really never feels rewarding to make the final boss the easiest boss after everything, and I just wish they would change this fight to make it more interesting after all the work you put in to get there. I mean, you're fully upgraded at this point. Why not use everything you've learned to take on an even harder and more grand version of the boss? As far as the story goes in Breath of the Wild, I have some pretty mixed feelings. For one, this is easily the most fleshed out and interesting version of Zelda and Link we've ever gotten. Being able to look back at all these small moments of their relationship in the past together and finding out more about their personalities than their purpose is something we really haven't gotten from a Zelda game before. That being said, pretty much the entirety of the story takes place in the past, through memories Link recollects through his journey. This makes the story feel very disconnected from the gameplay itself. I get why they did it, it makes it easier to play Breath of the Wild in any order you want, but it definitely lowers the stakes of the plot because you already know what's going to happen. Some of the most interesting characters of the game are only found within these memories, which almost feels like a waste of potential in a way. If anything though, this is a good sign for Breath of the Wild 2 because we've already taken care of all the memory stuff, now we can finally live in the present. So after 200 hours, Breath of the Wild has proven a lot to me. Is the game flawed? Yes. Is it still a contender for one of the best games ever made? I think so. As far as I'm concerned, Breath of the Wild has one of the best open worlds ever created, and while it's riddled with missteps and flaws, it never gets old to explore even 200 hours later. My complaints feel pretty minor in the grand scheme of the game because I truly do love Breath of the Wild and all the adventures it's taken me on. If you haven't played it yet, I think it's a must if you're a video game lover. Breath of the Wild 2 has a lot to live up to, and also a lot of things it needs to fix if it wants to be a truly worthy successor. But I'm curious, what would you guys like to see improved upon or changed in the sequel? By the way guys, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. I am trying to hit 10k subscribers by the end of the year, and I have a ton of really fun videos planned for next year, so I would be super happy if you joined me for those. Anyways, keep gaming to the fullest. Peace.